about Brazil. And I think that, yes, you are curious about Brazil. That's why you are here. And so thank you very much for attending this side event that we are organizing during the high-level political forum. Just for some logistic information, this session will be recorded and it will have translations for Portuguese and Spanish. So you just need to adjust your preference in the Zoom button on the bar below in your screen so you can hear and understand what we are going to talk about. And also another piece of information is that if you want to share about what we are doing here, or commenting using your social media, please use the hashtags Brazil and also the hashtag, the formal hashtag for this high-level political forum, which is HLPF 2022. Okay, so my name is Alessandra Nilo. I'm from Gestus, HIV Communication and Gender, an NGO based in Brazil. And I am one of the co-facilitators of the Civil Society Working Group for the 2030 Agenda, which is a network composed by 60 organizations in Brazil. And the idea behind this session is that for governments to play a leading role in the 2030 Agenda, they need to measure the results. They need to plan in advance and they need to establish transparent and effective partnerships with all stakeholders. So they can create this environment of well-informed process in order to make the good decisions about the public policies. So with that in mind, we organized this session in partnership with our colleagues here, particularly with the Institute of Sustainable Cities. And we will present today two complementary reports developed by civil society initiatives in Brazil. And these both reports, they have innovative methodologies and they were created to support national and local governments to implement the 2030 Agenda. Of course, if you are someone that is curious about Brazil, so you know a little bit about what's going on in Brazil, you know that the task upon us of working and supporting governments in moving towards the alignment with the 2030 Agenda is not an easy one. At this moment, for instance, in Brazil, you see a lot of the rights being violated. And we have seen the news that every day we have new problems arising. So at this stage for civil society, what we can say is that we have been treated as an enemy for the current federal government. And just to give you a recent information for this high-level political forum, for instance, Bolsonaro's government has denied the entry of civil society organizations into the national delegation, which has always been a democratic tradition in the country. But you have a lot of time to discuss that. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Jorge Abraão to present the Sustainable Development of Cities Index, which is an initiative of Institute of Sustainable Cities in Brazil in partnership with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and also supported from the City Nova project. The session is divided in two parts. In this first part, we will address more this initiative that is focusing on monitoring the cities. And the second part, we will talk about the national context where we will present the civil society spotlight for the 2030 Agenda. So George is director of the Sustainable Cities Institute, which is an organization also member of the Civil Society Working Group for 2030 Agenda in Brazil. He is a former advisor of the UN Global Compact, of the National Commission of the SDGs in Brazil that was eliminated by the government of Brazil. And he is currently a member of the São Paulo's SDGs State Commission and also member of the City Commission in São Paulo. Welcome, George. You have the floor.
Bom dia, Alessandra. Obrigado pela introdução. Bom dia a todas e todos que nos assistem e que estão presentes aqui no painel. É um prazer estar aqui junto com vocês. O Instituto, a importância das cidades que a gente tem percebido, sobretudo nos últimos anos, isso vem se aguçando, não é? Mas a pandemia, ela trouxe uma centralidade para as cidades muito forte. Não é? Ficou muito claro que as tomadas de decisão locais são fundamentais para a gente poder enfrentar qualquer tipo de problema. E as cidades podem, sim, evitar retrocessos e também assumir compromissos positivos autonomamente, independentemente de um governo federal, por exemplo. O estímulo ao avanço das cidades em agendas importantes pode contribuir muito para o enfrentamento dos desafios que a gente tem pela frente. No Brasil, 85% das pessoas vivem em cidades e o Instituto Cidades Sustentáveis se propõe a estar estimulando as cidades a avançarem dentro de compromissos e agendas como a Agenda 2030, o Acordo de Paris, para que a gente possa, de alguma forma, caminhar na direção do desenvolvimento sustentável. O Instituto tem, já faz muitos anos, uma plataforma que estimula as cidades a avançarem na direção do desenvolvimento sustentável, a plataforma do programa Cidades Sustentáveis, e mais recentemente está lançando um índice de desenvolvimento sustentável das cidades em parceria com a SDSN, para estimular as cidades a conseguirem se enxergar dentro da Agenda 2030 e avançarem com os compromissos de sustentabilidade. Então, para estimular esse avanço é que houve essa reflexão e esse lançamento, estamos lançando esse Índice de Desenvolvimento Sustentável das Cidades, que eu vou rapidamente aqui apresentar para vocês e vou compartilhar com vocês o conceito e como é que nós estamos efetivamente trabalhando e tentando estimular as cidades com o índice. Então, eu vou aqui compartilhar a minha tela. Eu espero que vocês estejam vendo. Estão vendo? Sim, Alessandra, eu estou te olhando. Sim, sim. Ok. Então, nós temos aqui o Índice de Desenvolvimento Sustentável, que nós estamos hoje contando rapidamente essa história, presenças nossas do Instituto no high level. O high level, como vocês sabem, ele acompanha o avanço dos países na Agenda 2030. Então, quando nós estávamos vendo esse processo dos países, nos perguntamos por que a gente não desenvolve algo para cidades. E aí, nesse sentido, quando voltamos ao Brasil, começamos a desenvolver uma parceria com a SDSN, que EMA está aqui representando, e com instituições aqui do Brasil, o SEBRAP, e um projeto que nós atuamos, que é o City Nova. Levantamos indicadores, 100 indicadores, na verdade, públicos no Brasil, e com isso relacionamos esses indicadores com os ODS, com os 17 ODS. Dessa relação saiu o Índice de Desenvolvimento Sustentável, que permite um posicionamento das cidades em relação à Agenda 2030, e conseguimos, com isso, classificar de alguma maneira as cidades de um nível baixo, muito baixo até muito alto em relação ao desenvolvimento sustentável. Esse é o conceito do índice, eu diria, e é essa forma que a gente está tentando estimular as cidades a avançarem, e eu vou só detalhar rapidamente algumas questões. É assim que a gente enxerga as cidades dentro do Índice de Desenvolvimento Sustentável. Eu diria assim que ele facilita ele ajuda muito o gestor público, a sociedade, o setor privado a olharem uma cidade e enxergarem de uma maneira panorâmica, porque você consegue ver como a cidade está nos 17 ODS através também dessas cores, que a vermelha quer dizer grandes desafios a serem enfrentados, e até a verde, que quer dizer objetivos atingidos. Isso aqui é um município, então nós teremos o nome do município, a posição dele no ranking que nós temos e qual é a nota que ele tem para que a gente possa acompanhar o nível dele. Então, essa é a primeira fotografia que a gente consegue ver das cidades, e isso é muito importante, digamos, para a gestão pública e para a sociedade de uma forma geral. Eu vou simular aqui, porque eu estou num PPT, clicar no ODS 3, que seria o ODS de saúde. Quando a gente clica num ODS, a gente consegue ver todos os indicadores que o compõem. E com isso a gente consegue enxergar e clicar num dos indicadores. E eu estou clicando aqui no Unidades Básicas de Saúde. E nós conseguimos ver, portanto, em cada indicador, qual é o gap, qual é a distância que existe entre o desejável e como a cidade está. Com isso, uma cidade consegue ver quais são os ODS mais frágeis, quais são os que ele tem virtudes e como é que ele consegue, de alguma maneira, enxergar cada um deles e onde é que estão os problemas e em que indicadores de uma forma geral. Portanto, o avanço disso nas cidades acaba fazendo com que a gente consiga enxergar as cidades, o desempenho delas, num radar de ODS. Não é isso aqui, é essa cidade, supostamente esse município em que a gente consegue enxergar como ela está e, dentro dos desafios, como ela pode alcançar um desenvolvimento alto ou muito alto em relação aos objetivos sustentáveis. A partir daí, existe a criação de um ranking ODS das cidades, em que a gente consegue ver as cidades brasileiras, cada uma em como está, com uma nota, e como cada ODS se encontra, portanto, em cada cidade. Isso é uma visão de país, eu diria, que a gente consegue ter, e é muito importante, cada cidade vai conseguir estar acessando, e a sociedade civil também, e isso acaba redundando num mapa do país, né? E esse mapa, esse é efetivamente o mapa do nível de desenvolvimento sustentável das cidades brasileiras, onde a gente consegue ver onde estão, digamos assim, as cidades com muito baixo desenvolvimento, e a gente tem uma mirada geral, olhando que, sobretudo no norte e nordeste, é onde as cidades têm o baixo e muito mais fortemente, fica muito mais claro isso. Portanto, um país pode definir seus desafios cada vez mais, definindo investimentos, onde colocar energias, enfim, em função do olhar. E esse olhar aqui esse olhar faz com que o Brasil seja o único país do mundo, o índice está permitindo que o Brasil seja o único país do mundo a acompanhar a evolução de todas as cidades, de todas as cidades nos 17 ODS. A gente acha que isso é uma questão inédita, importante, que a gente pode contribuir com outros países para estarem avançando nessa direção. Eu estou caminhando para o fim, Alessandra, e só para poder finalizar, eu diria assim, a partir daquele mapa, só para vocês, para todos e todas terem uma noção, nós podemos fazer muitos recortes. Nós podemos olhar as cidades, mas nós podemos olhar um cluster de cidades que nós queiramos acompanhar, uma região metropolitana, um grupo de cidades que faz parte de determinado espaço importante, mas nós podemos também acompanhar os estados, nós podemos acompanhar e verificar dentro de um estado quais são os desequilíbrios, quais são as desigualdades, nós podemos acompanhar uma região do país, o país como um todo, o bioma, de alguma forma, nós podemos acompanhar biomas e também podemos dividir pelos temas dos ODS e enxergar, digamos assim, as cidades brasileiras através dos temas. As regiões nós podemos ver desta forma aqui, e esse é um número efetivamente que tem acontecido dentro dos nossos levantamentos, como cada região está, como as cidades de cada região, a média do nível de desenvolvimento sustentável das cidades dessa região. Nós podemos olhar os biomas de alguma forma, e aqui tem um olhar muito forte, e a gente separou em biomas e quais são as notas, e observem que a Amazônia, que tem tido o olhar hoje não é, do mundo inteiro, dada a sua importância em relação às florestas, à biodiversidade, como as cidades da Amazônia, de alguma maneira, são cidades que têm um nível muito baixo de desenvolvimento, mostrando um desafio enorme que a gente tem. Para vocês terem uma noção, das 10 piores cidades, das 5.570 cidades brasileiras, das 10 piores cidades, 9 estão na Amazônia. Desafios que a gente tem para poder avançar. E finalizo dizendo que a gente pode também clicar num ODS. E aí nós temos um mapa do Brasil em cada um dos ODS, e aqui é um exemplo do ODS de educação, o ODS 4. Então, nós conseguimos ver também como as cidades estão em relação ao tema de educação, onde estão os maiores desafios para a gente poder avançar. Com isso, nós acreditamos que com a apresentação e a disponibilidade do índice, e ele é uma ferramenta gratuita que está disponível para todas e todos, não é? Toda a sociedade brasileira e a gestão pública, nós queremos com isso estar estimulando, contribuindo para as cidades se enxergarem como um todo e atuarem, enfrentarem os problemas onde estão, digamos assim, aparecendo nessa visão geral os maiores desafios que temos. Para, a partir daí, implementar ações, por exemplo, com a plataforma do Programa Sustentável ou outros programas. E finalizo dizendo que a gente pretende rodar esse índice todo ano, e com isso, da mesma forma que os países estão medindo sua evolução, que a gente consiga estar medindo a evolução das cidades brasileiras e estar levando isso ao high level para mostrar que, levando a ONU para mostrar o caminho que as cidades brasileiras estão tomando, levando bons exemplos e, com isso, estimulando o seu avanço. Eu paro por aqui. Obrigado pela atenção.
Thank you very much, George. Very, very interesting, and to see how much, how many ideas we can have to really push the governments and support the governments, particularly at the cities and territories where the 2030 agenda must be realized to implement this alignment with the sustainable development goals. And I'd like now to invite Emma Torres. She's Vice President for Americas from Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is partnering with your project. Emma, you have the floor. Welcome.
Apologies. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this very interesting panel. And thank you, Georgia, for a fantastic presentation. Really, the work that has been advanced with this report is extraordinary. And I'm sure, it will be very informative for other regions, for other countries to follow. The Sustainable Development Solutions Network issues annually a report on the progress towards the SDGs for all the countries that are members of the United Nations. But our network, which encompasses now more than 1,600 universities globally, also has national and regional networks that are making progress with regional overviews. We will be launching in a couple of weeks the Latin American Sustainable Development Index, which will be issued by our center in the University of Los Andes in Colombia. And we have it for Africa, for various regions and various countries. But I think the richness of this report is particularly significant because it gives an overview of a very comprehensive overview of a country that has a continental size. So it is particularly important and I think very relevant for the global discussions. I am going to make some comments, brief comments about our report that is just being issued in June, the global report. But I would like, before I do that, highlight the point that Jorge made in the sense that, unfortunately, the Amazon biome has one of the worst index in terms of the cities. And this is very worrisome, obviously, because it's such an important area. And I would like to highlight here that the Sustainable Development Solutions Network is the convener of the Science Panel for the Amazon. The Science Panel of the Amazon is composed of over 240 scientists that for the first time they can issue an assessment of the state of the basin. It's on a scientific basis. That report is available and is being launched at Glasgow. And one of the follow-ups we want to do is go into a more detailed, precisely dealing what are the challenges and how the science can contribute to sustainable cities, to sustainable infrastructure in the Amazon. So I will certainly continue the dialogue with George and his team and see how we can, have some common agendas between the science panel of the Amazon and the cities that you're advancing. Our report this year has been issued at the beginning of June, and I will just want to highlight 5 of the key messages that the report came up. Number 1 is peace, diplomacy, and international cooperation are fundamental conditions for the world to progress towards the SDGs and to progress towards the Agenda 2030. Unfortunately, for the second year in a row, the world is no longer making progress towards the SDGs. And this is a very significant setback that we have had. We are advocating for a global plan to finance the SDGs as an urgent matter. As a matter of fact, the Deputy Secretary General, together with Professor Sachs, are convening a high-level group to discuss precisely how to mobilize globally additional financial resources, particularly for the South, to implement the SDGs. A third message is that we are at the midpoint of the 2030, and the commitments and the policies vary across countries. So we definitely don't have a coordinated commitment globally. However, we are very much looking forward to the summit that will take place next year, 2023, with the heads of state that we hope that will renew commitment to it's a unique opportunity for them to renew commitment to achieving the SDGs. A fourth message in our report is that rich countries generate negative international spillovers, notably through unsustainable consumption. And obviously, we see that the issues, for instance, on the chain supplies and so on, and Europe has beginning to take action in this regard. This is a very important area that probably the network, our own network, is going to work much more in deep in the years to come. COVID-19 pandemic has forced data providers to innovate and to make new partnerships. And we feel that this is very significant and it's important to leverage and scale up these partnerships in order, precisely like you're doing, to monitor cities, but to monitor a number of things and different indicators, etc., to promote the SDG impact by 2030 and beyond. So I will very much welcome you to look at our site, check the report, and we have also all the other reports available that have been produced under the network. And we look very much forward to continue working with you. Cities are extremely important. Like Jorge was saying, cities have been the basis also to respond to the pandemic, and it's going to be the basis to respond to climate change and other crises. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to join you in this event.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you very much. And if you can you please write down here the link where we can download the report, so we can put that information in our summary of the session and also help to distribute that.
Excellent, thank you.
Sure. And I think that we need really to come together, and we have been discussing yesterday in the session around financing for sustainable development, a lot of suggestions, and particular the idea of the global fund to fund the SDGs is among the issues that were mentioned yesterday here in the high-level political forum. And for all of you that are watching our session, we had just had now a comprehensive overview about a tool that was created to monitor the advancements of the SDGs at local level, I mean, at the cities. And now we would like to present the other tool that we developed in Brazil by the Civil Society Working Group for the 2030 Agenda, which is the Spotlight Report. This Spotlight Report, it's part of historical series that we began in 2017. This is the 60th report that we are launching. And it is currently the only publication that we have now in Brazil that presents a panorama of the level of implementation of all SDGs at national level. So we are covering the social, economics, and environmental sectors, and we are monitoring all targets that are applying to Brazil. So another important point about this report is that we always use official data. So it's not us, civil society, saying or analyzing what government is doing or not, but we are really trying to use official data to classify the level of progress. It has been published by Gestus and the Civil Society Working Group, as I mentioned. And this year we have the contribution of 101 experts from all sectors that analyzed the data and produced the report. And also it is named Spotlight Report because we are not only trying to map out the problems, but we are also suggesting solutions. How can we address the solutions that we are mapping when we see the level of implementation in Brazil? It's so low. In fact, what we have now is a federal government that is completely opposing the SDGs, because it is completely opposing all agenda there is based on rights, either in social rights or environmental rights or economic rights. So the situation in Brazil, it's really complicated. And as you know, this is an election year. And this is also a particular good moment for us to reflect on how the community, the international community could support us in making sure that we will have, more support in terms of being civil society and working in a such harsh environment. So the Spotlight report was released this last 3rd of June during a public hearing in the National Congress, and everybody was quite shocked, although not surprised, but still shocked, because at least 8%, more than 80% of the all targets that we analyze are on regression or threatened or had really insufficient progress. The situation is very, very complicated. But to present that, I'd like to invite our colleague Alice Junqueira from Climax Brazil. She's also member of the Civil Society Working Group for the 2030 Agenda. Alice, you have the floor. Welcome. And also you can download the report, the Civil Society Spotlight report, in Portuguese and English. And here in the chat, there is the link where you can download the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, colleagues. I'm sorry, my throat is a little bit sore. I'm gonna try to speak slower so you can understand me. But unfortunately, the reality of Brazil is once more deeply concerning, as Alessandra said. And in this report, we have evaluated 168 targets, and the result is a country that is leading the way in setbacks. Juliana, please, can you change the slide? Here you have the graphics. There was no available data for 8 targets, and only one has demonstrated satisfactory progress, which was target 15.8, focused on the prevention and control of invasive alien species. 24 targets had insufficient progress, 11 remained or became stagnant, and 14 are at risk. We had setbacks in 110 targets compared to 92 in 2020. This means in 2021, we had setbacks in more than a half of the targets, around 65%. If we zoom in and check the targets of SDGs related to the environmental and social dimensions, Juliana, please. It's easier to understand the catastrophe. Around 90% of each set of targets you can see in the graphic shows didn't present any progress, which means they were stagnant or at risk or had setbacks. Juliana, please. And this is because the Brazilian government chose once again to do little or nothing. It has reduced or depleted budgets and interrupted various policies and monitoring systems. For example, the allocation for the National Fund for Development of Science and Technology represented just 0.001% of total public spending. Only 41% of the budget for environmental inspections was spent, and between 2019 and 2020, the budget for housing policies has decreased over 70%. In addition, we had to deal with new bills and policies that threaten people and the environment. Examples are the presidential veto of the law ensuring internet access for teachers and students of public schools, and the approval of 562 pesticides for use in 2021, including some banned in the US and the European Union. Finally, we have witnessed the lack of commitment with other international agreements and weak diplomacy, as well as shrinking spaces for public participation and limited public access to information. We highlight that the government submitted new data to the NDC, masking 400 million tons of greenhouse gases, participated in COP26 with the same commitments presented in 2015, and did not ratify the Escazú Agreement, which is focused on the access to information, public participation, and access to justice in environmental affairs in Latin America and the Caribbean. All of this, of course, led to major impacts that have deepened gender and racial inequalities. We had new records of sea level rise, fires, and deforestation. Deforestation alone has increased 79% compared to 2020, and in indigenous lands between 2019 and 2021, it was 138% higher than the previous 3 years. Regarding the pandemic, a study presented last year in March at the National Congress showed that by that time, 120,000 of COVID-19 deaths could have been presented. No wonder people affected by 100 have increased from around 19 million in 2020 to around 33 million in 2021, and more than a half, 58.7% of the population live in some degree of food insecurity. At the same time, poor people had less access to quality education, housing, and sanitation services, while the massive sexual, psychological, political, and police violence pointed out last year have escalated even more. How many times we will have to denounce misogyny and the genocide of Black and Indigenous people? Also, we cannot forget that in addition to higher impacts on women, Black, Indigenous, and LGBTIQA+ people due to gender and racial inequalities, evidence also keeps showing higher impacts on children and youth, disabled and older people, migrants, and refugees due to the other forms of inequalities we all know about. Now, please, I would like to call Claudio, who's going to talk about the economic and institutional dimensions, zooming in with the targets and data.
Thank you, Alice. Claudio, so since Alice invited you, can you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you very much, Alessandra. Thank you, Alice. Good morning, good afternoon, evening, everyone. I don't know where you're coming from and watching from. I'm Claudio Fernandez. I'm the senior economist of the Brazilian Civil Society Network for the 2030 agenda and of justice as well. I'm going to present what we called the economic axis of the report. And before I start, I would like to also congratulate Jorge Aragão and Cidades Sustentáveis, the Sustainable Cities Index report. It's extremely important to monitor the progress, or in the case of Brazil, in many cases, setback of the sustainable development on the ground, because that's actually where people live. They live in cities, they live in the rural areas, but they live on the ground. And here I'm going to present more kind of a macro data aspect of the country that in some ways also it comes as a mirror and a complementary process to what the city index presents. So let me see if there we go. So we have mapped out 57 economic targets in the SDGs, mostly involved in the SDG 8, 9, 10, 12, and 17. Of these 57 economic targets, 37 of them are in complete setback in the country. One is stagnant, one is at risk, 13 have insufficient progress. And insufficient progress means you cannot sacrifice health, you cannot sacrifice education, you cannot sacrifice social assistance to pay high interest in short-term debt to finance your operations. And that's the situation of Brazil. Mr. Sachs yesterday at the Financing for Development session called attention to the need to invest in infrastructure and much more in the human infrastructure of the countries to be able to implement the SDGs. But Brazil is going in the other direction. 8 of the targets of economic targets had no data, and economically speaking, there's no progress whatsoever toward sustainable development in Brazil. And now I'm going to show you the pictures. They say pictures speak more, more than 1,000 words. I think these pictures are going to speak more than 1,000,000 words to the situation of the country. So here's a picture of the industrial setback. So Brazil has reached, as you can see in the graphic, a lower level of the participation of the industrial sector in the GDP than 1947. Right now, the transformation industry is only 11.3, pardon, 11.3% of the share of the GDP in the country. And one of the things that we have to pay attention as well is that some of that transformation industry in Brazil involves construction industry, which should not be in there, but also is in there. So if we take construction industry, things would get even worse. And here it follows the situation where Brazil is becoming a neo-colonial provider, which means a reprimarization, if I can say that in English, which is going back to the primary aspects of the economic development, which is getting away from the industry, getting away from innovation, and investing a lot on exploitation and extractivism. And as you can see there, from 2020 to 2021, there is a staggering growth in extractivism and agribusiness compared to a collapse in the industry as a participation in the GDP as well as a share of that. So the country is returning to a state of neocolonialism, and the government is a big culprit of this. This is just the public investment in the logistics and transportation infrastructure of the country. As you can see, from 2012 to 2022, it's a decade of fast collapse on logistics investment. So without logistics, the economy does not move. And that's just a basic concept. And there is no way that the economy is going to move without the proper infrastructure being installed. But this is just basic bricks and mortar type of infrastructure. If we think of a more human intellectual capital, then we can see that the government is just reducing investment on education. quoting again Mr. Sachs from yesterday's session, education is the basic infrastructure for sustainable development. We need to capacitate, develop mentally so people can innovate, people can create new solutions. Because as Alessandra likes to say a lot, do the same thing over and over again is not a solution. So we have to innovate, but to innovate, we have to have capacity for that. And the capacity for innovation means education, research, science, technology, and the country is not investing at all in any of these areas. Much the opposite, is reducing the investment in these areas just to pay the interest of short-term debt. And that is not sustainable at all. So without education, there will be no development, much less sustainable development. Pardon, I did not translate this to, but I can show is that this picture of economic stagnation is that in the past year, there was a major drop in the share of wages in GDP from 35 to 30% in 2021. And that also came together with an increase of the amount of people that are receiving the lowest common wage, which is the minimum wage of the country. So more people are receiving low wage than higher wage. So without buying power, there collapses aggregate demand. This is a basic concept of economics. If you have no aggregate demand, then you're going to rely too much on exports, then your population is going to get poorer and poorer. Your industry is not going to produce enough because you don't have enough demand. And then you concentrate a lot on just getting the easiest stuff out. And that's the situation of the country at this moment. Without aggregate demand, no economic development. And here's a little notice about the inflation, the big culprit of the moment. Inflation is probably going to be a word that is going to be spoken many times at the HLPF. And at this time, inflation has nothing to do with demand. In the case of Brazil, this is extremely evident because there is a drop in aggregate demand and there could be no demand inflation. So here's a picture of unemployment. And these pictures, they are complementary to show a big, a complete narrative of the situation of the country. That unemployment is very high and it's been consistently high for a long time. Here we're starting at the first quarter of 2019. So it's been about varying from 13% to 11% with slight drops in seasonal moments. But here's the line that is really concerning and that most of the time the press does not talk about and governments do not want to talk about. It's the rate of idleness of the population. When you go to small towns, for instance, small cities, as George was talking about, the cities are being supported by pretty much retirement funds that the older population of those cities receive, and there's no development of new jobs in those cities. As we saw, industrial sector has been collapsing for quite a while. So without jobs, people get desperate. And when people get desperate, a lot of social problems happens, and particularly violence, as Alice reported very well, and the destruction of the environment, because then they want to, in a sense, develop at any cost. Here's another big problem in the country: unpaid domestic labor. 64% of the population, work on domestic labor. Out of the 64% of the population that work on domestic labor in some way or another, 92% are women. 65% of those are Black African Brazilians, or what we call in Brazil, pardas, or brown women. Out of this, 96% are not paid. It's unpaid domestic labor. Aunts, grandmothers, mothers, kids that work for no pay whatsoever. So in a nutshell, the women carry the country on their back, because without domestic labor, how people are gonna, live and be able to go to their jobs and everything. And 96% of the 92% of the women that work in domestic labor are unpaid. And what happens then in the end? That's the conclusion of a situation that the graph on the left just shows it very easily. That's the GDP per capita per year in US dollars. Brazilians are getting poorer in the world. Since 2000, there was an increase on their wealth, on their net worth, until the half of the decade, until 2010, but then starts to come down, and that was an effect specifically of the major financial crisis and what it's called the Great Recession that it triggered in 2007, 2008, and then carried on for a while. But then as you observe, and I don't have a graph to compare with other countries, there is a major collapse in that GDP per capita, and that had nothing to do with the financial crisis anymore. Now it had to do with bad policy, with bad economic decisions. And the 2011 Economic Nobel Prize winner actually studies the long-term effect of bad policies. And it's a big warning about Brazil. A sequence of bad economic policies, a sequence of bad social policies, and disastrous environmental policies. It's creating a very long-term effect for the country that is going to be very hard to build from, if things start getting better. And that needs to be very much in everybody's mind, that there'll be no miracle. There are no miracles in the economy if you do not develop proper policies for that. There'll be no industrial sector, no innovation without education. And so we have to make a choice. And as Alessandra said, we do have a lot of recommendations. We not only bring the data and analyze the data, we have a lot of recommendations. But so far, in the past 6 years, the recommendations from the Civil Society Working Group for the 2030 Agenda have been ignored by the government, the central government, the federal government, most of the state governments, and the biggest majority of the municipal governments. And here is a final thing that I would like to highlight, which is for this high-level political forum, which is civil society needs to be recognized as the main implementer of the 2030 Agenda. There's no private sector. There are no governments that are doing as much as civil society is doing, not only monitoring the process of implementation, but also creating solutions. Those solutions need to be leveraged. They need to have investment so they can actually create a larger impact. So small solutions from rural areas and from small cities in Brazil, and we have a whole report about those, needs to be leveraged so they can actually multiply and reach other municipalities. And in this way, we can build sustainable development in the continental country from the ground up. So what is the big knot? What is the big lag? Civil society has no access to finance. I would like to actually call attention to the Secretary General and Mr. Sachs to the fact that we need, first and foremost, to find a way to finance civil society in a sustainable process. Not only philanthropy, not only project-based, but actually a sustainable flow of financial resources so civil society can perform better, and more impactfully its work that it's been doing now since 2015. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudio, and thank you, Alicia, for presenting the Spotlight report. And thank you, Claudio, for the provocative comments. What we have watching here is really that actually civil society that is not progressive, civil society that is really pushing against the advancements of the SDGs, these are the civil society getting the funds. And this is very concerning, really, when we see that here at the UN, people continue talking about private sector investments after 7 years of the improvement of the SDGs without any evidence showing that the private sector is really going to invest in the SDGs as they should. Not even the discussions around regulatory measures. that needs to be in place in order to make them accountable, we have advanced on that. So this is very sad situation, and we hope the governments at some point can listen to us. And now I'd like to invite Roberto Bisiu, who is coordinator of the Social Watch International, because I think Roberto has a long time experience in producing reports and analyzing exactly the situation that we are addressing here, discussing here, because Brazil is an example, a bad example of a country where could be now advancing with the implementation of the goals, but choose not doing so. And it's not because we are lacking legal framework or lacking design of policies and programs. That's because the government just decided to go in another direction. So Roberto, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. And I am really very impressed with the presentations and with browsing the reports. I mean, it's a lot of work having gone into them, amazing. And it's also a lot of networking and organizational work to get so many organizations on board. That is usually the invisible part of the civil society reports. That is not the work of some consultants that were hired to produce a report, and they maybe do excellent job, but this is actually coming from the grassroots up, and developing a whole variety of processes of dialogue, consultation, deliberation, and so on behind every page of those reports. And that should be highlighted, because it's the invisible part, but it's the part that makes those reports heavy in the sense of having an influence, a power, the capacity of hopefully producing changes. So in that regard, again, my congratulations. It's an enormous amount of work, and coming, as I hope it comes, on the eve of changes in Brazil for next year, it makes us hopeful about not so much about what the current government will do with the accusation, all the evidence that is there, because there are many other evidences and accusations that have been gathering and have not found a response, but what the people will decide and the new government will implement is key for Brazil, it's key for all of Latin America, is key for all of the South. So really our eyes are very much on you. And I am making this comment particularly elaborating on what just has been said. The 2030 agenda and the SDGs as a collection of its goals is a political document and reflects a political commitment, not a treaty obligation, like, for example, the agreements at the World Trade Organizations are, or a binding obligations like the agreement signed with the IMF are. But it's a political commitment, and therefore it is this kind of reporting that can help create the political will now or soon to actually change and move in that direction. So having said all of that, I cannot stop asking, in a way, some questions to all of us to consider in the future. The very last goal of the SDGs, 1719, says that we need a different indicator than GDP to measure sustainable development, to understand and summarize what sustainable development is. because actually we have the 2030 agenda and we had Agenda 21 before that, but we still don't have a working definition of what sustainable definition is. And we do have a set of goals, but are all these goals the same in weight and importance? And what are the missing goals? For example, we struggled a lot in the process of Agenda 2030 to include the goal 10 on inequality, which is a very important goal for Brazil and for many other countries in Latin America, which is the region with the highest inequalities in the world. And yet, none of the indicators in goal 10 actually refer to inequalities. They refer to aspects that are maybe related to inequalities, but they don't address the core. And this is not for lack of indicators, because the Gini index is there and has been there for more than a century, and the information for that is there, is because of lack of political commitment, lack of agreement, that even the same governments that decided, oh yes, we will put inequalities in there, but didn't want it to give some concrete measure, because behind the measure comes the action. So that leads me to think that, yes, we have a lot of trees in these 169 indicators that are part of the forest, but the sum of them doesn't necessarily define the whole forest. And in that sense, my looking at the impressive work around the cities of Brazil, and how they build the index and so on, which I don't doubt is going to be extremely useful, particularly when we go into the components and the details. I had that sense, is it really so that all the cities in the state of Sao Paulo are the most sustainable cities in Brazil? Is that the case? What does sustainable mean? I can clearly see the index spreading on the map and saying this is probably correlating quite well with the Human Development Index. I have no doubt the quality of life in many aspects in the state of Sao Paulo is much bigger than in Pará or any of the states of the Amazonia. But can we really say that they are more sustainable? What about what Emma was mentioning about the negative spillovers, the pollution, the carbon emissions, all the different aspects of the consumption and maldevelopment symptoms, which we have all around the world? You know, can the whole notion of sustainable development on a global scale leads us to say no country can claim to be sustainable developed because of its situation, because a circular economy, as has been envisaged, doesn't really exist anywhere, but also because of the negative spillovers of their actions. So how can a country claim to be sustainable developed if it has a high level of emissions and of carbon emissions into the air that create harm elsewhere without any kind of compensation? Or how can a country be sustainably developed if it hosts fiscal havens that undermine the development of others by stimulating financial flows? So that's the kind of, I would say, questions that I have, and that probably in the midterm review should come up and say, yes, we are using those tools that they provided to us, even without completely agreeing with them, because we can go to the government and say, you approve this. This is your commitment. It is not my crazy idea of civil society. This is what you said you would do. And that legitimizes demand for it to be executed. That's fantastic. But at the same time, we have to improve on the direction. We have to improve on the details, on the notion of what sustainable development actually is and how we measure it. It's a challenge that is in the agenda, but so far has been evaded because it's very, very uncomfortable. And that is, I think, something that during this high-level political forum, we should start to discuss and say, how do we make sure that we come back next year for the midterm review and really push on some of these key issues. So yeah, congratulations really to all of you, and an invitation to continue the hard work and the reflection.
Thank you very much, Roberto. You brought a very comprehensive overview about the challenges of the 2030 agenda itself, but also I think it's important to always to recognize that not even what was agreed before, and it's not only about the SDGs, it's about many other international commitments, not even that were yet on the table to really be implemented. In the case of Brazil, which we are discussing here, the hardest for me side of that is that the SDGs are completely aligned with our federal constitution. I mean, except for the targets related to internet connections and new technologies, because at that time we didn't have that. All the other areas are somehow related to what we have in our, legal framework. And it has been completely, put aside just because of the government's not aligned with that. One of the conversations that also I'd like to have in this high-level political forums and in moving towards the midterm review is, what can we do with the SDGs when you have governments that are not opposing? And this again bring us back to the issue of civil society capacity to continue this response. Because if it was not for the index about the cities, and if it was not for the civil society spotlight report, we will have no information, no clue about what will be happening in Brazil in terms of the alignment with the SDGs. And I think the same situation is happening in many other countries around the world. And the other point, I think it's very interesting to our conversation, and I'd like to open the floor for comments from now on. It's what is the capacity that we have within the multilateral systems for pushing for these progressive agendas, while we have, and here we are back again to the first part of the conversation, why we have the UN and the multilateral system so kidnapped by economic powers and forces that are absolutely opposing to the SDGs, absolutely opposing to any idea of sustainable development. How could you have big companies and corporations affirming that they are, aligned with the SDGs when their way of production, their products, everything they do, it's completely absurd, opposing the SDGs? And what is the role of the multilateral banks that continue to finance these unsustainable projects around, the world? So this alignment, it's so big at this stage that I think the only way forward is really to keep educating civil society about the human rights and the sustainable development. And yesterday we had a session only to discuss the target 4.7, which is about education on sustainable development. And we need to push for that, because otherwise civil society is not going to be aware. Here on the opening session of the SDGs yesterday, we have a metaversal group singing, for connecting with the youth. And that was so odd, so strange, because, we need to really invest in politicizing our youth invest in politicizing society so we can really have capacity to demand our rights, because it's not something that we are asking, kindly asking the governments. We are talking about our basic rights, including the rights to have, you know, a live planet to be on and to continue, you know, living here. So the floor is open for comments. Please be welcome. You just need to raise your hands, and I will try to see here on the chat. You would like to make comments? Toko Madonko, please welcome and introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. My name is Thokozile Madonko. I'm actually with the Heinrich Böll Foundation based in Cape Town. So this has been really a fantastic input as we kind of try and grapple with the current multiple crises that we're facing, both in our regions and globally. And I was really curious. So I suppose my question speaks a little bit to the presentation around unemployment, around the lowering GDP per capita, and then this other point that I think is it Roberta raised about, well, how can we begin to really talk about an alternative to GDP? And so I would be really curious if there's any advice or thinking and even resources that you think would be useful to really push this issue. Because, you know, we're seeing it here in South Africa. It's the same thing, that we've had jobless growth. We've seen massive unemployment, and then where there is employment into the care sector. And yet we keep hearing, you know, GDP. So yeah, thank you so much. I hope I wasn't talking too fast for the interpreters, and thank you to the interpreters.
Thank you, Toko. Since I do not see any other hand raised, I'd like to invite Claudio to comment on that question, and please, others, feel free to join.
Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you, Ms. Madonko. Yes, GDP is not sufficient at all. It's been an outdated measurement for at least 40 years already. But countries do still use it as the basic structure of their monitoring of the situation, of the economic situation of the country. It is a hodgepodge of so many things that even, for instance, includes the fact that, you know, public investment, private investment, it's all kind of bundled together, and you do not really separate to see where things are going, in which direction. It's extremely inefficient and insufficient. Although, and here's one thing, considering what both Roberto and Alessandra talked about, it is the measurement that is being used by the standard, in between quotes, the standard market approach to make decisions and to see what kind of financial investment should be directed to which area. So it's a kind of a macro you know, measurement that it reveals less than it hides. It hides a lot. But at the same time, in a situation like Brazil right now, or even South Africa, or most of the developing countries, it can reveal quite a bit if we compare to other things. So for instance, the share, as one of the things that caught my attention during the research, is the collapse of the share of the industrial sector in the GDP. Because when we think, for instance, industrial sector, that's the largest, should be, in a sense, kind of one of the largest portion of an economy. industrial sector, the service sector, so we can separate a little bit, which is still another way of measuring it and not, completely current either. But what we can do is and this is one of the efforts that we do in this report, is that we cross-reference of different indexes to see if we can bring more of a context, in the sense of that, for instance, the share of wages in the GDP is a way to show that the wages have been stagnant for so long. It could have been, for instance, a historical series of wages in Brazil, a graph that would show actually a drop in the wages throughout for the past decade. But at the same time, the representation within the GDP is that it's part of the creative direction of this report as well, is that we want to use the same language that the market uses to show them that even in their own language, the situation is dire. So they can easily understand and not question. So for instance, they say, oh, now you're coming with a happiness index, like for instance, Bhutan. Bhutan has happiness index. And it's been proposed even by Joseph Stiglitz during the panel of creating a new index for measuring, economic performance of countries. But then the market comes and says, oh, no, this is kind of a pipe dream idea, happiness index. We're not going to consider that. Too holistic, too alternative. And then we say, okay, yeah, it's not, but we're not going to argue in that direction. Let's speak your language and let me show you in your terms the real situation. Because here's another caveat, and with this I finish, is that statistics and indexes can manipulate narrative very easily. We can manipulate any kind of graph and create a narrative around that graph that can be positive, negative, or neutral based on how we focus. And that's one of the efforts that we do with the Spotlight Report for Sustainable Development in Brazil. We always try to cross-reference indexes and data so we can bring context. Because if you take a look at the context, and then we can see how the narrative goes from a collapse of an industrial sector to lowering the wages to growth of unemployment and idleness and everything. So that's a way of putting, and that's a way that we try to kind of, as we say in soccer, dribble the limitations of those indexes. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. Thank you very much. I will give the floor to Jorge and then invite Emma, who needs to leave, to final words, and then Alice and Roberto. Jorge, please. I want to say George, but it's Jorge in Portuguese.
Obrigado, Alessandra. Eu queria só fazer alguns comentários. Obrigado a todos que de alguma forma se referiram a isso, Cláudio, Roberto, a todos que interviram aqui. Eu queria só rapidamente fazer uma reflexão sobre também o que Roberto e Cláudio falaram, e Alessandra, você também, mas é mais dizer assim que Roberto levanta, né? Será que as cidades de São Paulo são realmente as cidades que têm o maior nível de desenvolvimento sustentável? É uma pergunta que eu acho que a gente tem que refletir mesmo sobre isso, porque no mapa tudo leva a crer que sim, que seja isso, não é? Mas o que eu percebo assim que é aquela história da média, não é? O fato de na média as questões irem bem não significa que nós, ao identificarmos determinados pontos, a gente não consiga determinados objetivos do desenvolvimento sustentável, nós não consigamos entender qual é, digamos assim, as fragilidades que eles têm. O que eu entendo é que essas ferramentas, elas estão longe de serem perfeitas, mas eu acho que elas podem, nós estamos subindo degraus. Quando o IDH foi lançado, e foi um grande avanço que nós tivemos, o IDH se baseou em 3 grandes indicadores: na expectativa de vida, no tempo médio que as pessoas estão nas escolas e na renda per capita. Isso foi um grande avanço em relação ao PIB, já que nós, de alguma forma, só analisávamos dessa maneira. Eu estou entendendo que isso foi um degrau,
e que nós agora estamos tentando avançar num outro degrau em que traz, ao invés de 3 indicadores, 17 indicadores, 17 objetivos que têm 100 indicadores que o compõem. Então, eu acho que, longe da perfeição, nós estamos, na verdade, tentando apurar mais e ter mais elementos para entender o que é esse tal de desenvolvimento sustentável, que, no fundo, é uma tentativa de integrar agendas e que nós possamos ter, com isso, uma visão mais, eu diria assim, mais ampla e mais integrada das nossas questões. Uma coisa que me pega muito, e eu acho que a todos nós, mas agora, recentemente, eu disse para vocês que no bioma amazônico, nós levantamos que das 10 piores cidades, 9 estão no bioma amazônico. Uma coisa que me pegou muito foi que, nesse lamentável episódio que nós tivemos aqui no Brasil, do assassinato do Bruno e do Dom Phillips, saiu uma foto em que o Dom, na verdade, saiu uma foto em que o suposto assassino deles estava sendo capturado, digamos assim, pela Polícia Federal. E tinha um grupo de jovens muito grande olhando, na fotografia aparecia um grupo de jovens descalços, mal vestidos. E uma coisa que nós ficamos pensando e discutimos foi: onde é que estão esses jovens? Qual é essa cidade que eles estão? Pois a cidade em que eles estavam era a 3ª pior cidade no IDH do Brasil. E que jovens serão formados a partir daí? Esses índices, o que estão mostrando é que nós temos efetivamente que avançar em determinados espaços. Volto a dizer, eles estão longe da perfeição, mas eles podem permitir que nós possamos enxergar a enorme desigualdade que há também nas cidades brasileiras. Não só internamente, porque internamente é um outro trabalho importantíssimo de ser feito. Inclusive, o Instituto faz mapas de desigualdades que mostram as desigualdades dentro de uma mesma cidade, e elas são extravagantes, são de assustar. Mas aquele mapa que eu mostrei aqui do índice, o que eu acho que ele pode nos trazer é uma primeira visão da enorme desigualdade que há, não é? Entre as cidades brasileiras. E o que isso pode também levar para uma reflexão da sociedade, dos gestores públicos? É que nós temos necessariamente que ter uma distribuição desigual de orçamentos num país como o Brasil. E nós temos que levar mais orçamento, mais investimento para esses lugares onde são mais desiguais. Então, se isso é verdade para uma cidade internamente, quando ela tem que se distribuir para os seus espaços mais vulneráveis os maiores recursos, isso também é verdade para um país. Isso pode ser óbvio, mas não é o que acontece. E o que a gente tem como esperança é que essas ferramentas possam estar mostrando, evidenciando, revelando essas questões, e, com isso, políticas públicas, porque só através delas nós vamos estar enfrentando os problemas, como o relatório Luz mostra em todos os problemas que ele traz, e é um orientador para isso, mas que políticas públicas possam estar sendo direcionadas em investimentos, porque a gente, com isso, pode permitir acessos, melhores condições para que a gente consiga reduzir essas desigualdades no nosso país. Bom, é isso. Obrigado, Alessandro.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much. I think you were mentioning that we need these indicators to convince our governments to use good sense when allocating resources, when defining public policies, and when making decisions that are affecting our lives, and sometimes conducting us to deaths, unnecessary deaths. And this year, the Spotlight Report is dedicated exactly to Don Phillips and Bruno, because this murder was really a sign about where we are. So with that, I'd like to invite Emma, and then Alicia and Roberto and Claudio to 2 minutes, 1 minute, actually, final words, because we are almost reaching our time. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very, very much. It's been an extraordinary rich panel and discussion. I'm particularly taken by some of the issues that you have brought up, which are very relevant, certainly for Brazil, but for other countries. And I would like to highlight specifically the need of investment in the social infrastructure that is critical if we're going to avoid conflicts and more problems. I'm also very taken by the point that Claudio made on how our region is going backwards in terms of, not investing in innovation, not investing in research, in education. This is a major agenda. It's very, very important. The Science Panel of the Amazon is advocating for that very strongly, because we feel very strongly that if we want to conserve the Amazonia, we have to invest on innovation and technology and research, because it's the only way that the forest will remain standing. So I'm very taken by all the big issues that have been brought in this report. I'm going to definitely share it with my colleagues in the network, because I think they really are pointing to issues that are not only relevant for Brazil and Latin America, but also globally. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Emma. It would be very appreciated if you can share the reports. And now I'd like to invite Eliza for final words.
Thank you, Alessandra, and everyone. No, I would just like to echo Mr. Roberto in the need for us to look closer to inequalities, because we know that inequalities are the core problem of what we are witnessing among development and developed countries and within the countries, nationally and locally. So we really need to improve. We have been shouting out about it, and we now need governments to really do their work.
Thank you very much, Eliza. Getting this goal 10 of inequality was among our big victories, because never before it was thought about inequality. It was always about decreasing poverty, decreasing hunger, but first time, big time, we are talking about inequalities.
And that perspective within all the SDGs, which is the analysis that we always do, the disaggregated data.
Yeah, definitely. Claudio, 1 minute final word.
Thank you, Alessandra. My final word is going to be about SDG 17, about bridging partnerships, creating conditions of possibility for financing the main implementers of the 2030 agenda, which is definitely our organized civil society, the people that are doing the work on the ground, the people that are monitoring, the people that are coming up with innovative ways of dealing with the problems, and highlight what Emma just said, science, technology, innovation, extremely necessary to keep the forest standing. And we have to pay much more, like 150% attention to the science and technology of the indigenous populations that live in the Amazon. We have to really say that we do not know. We are incapable of keeping the forest up. Only the knowledge, which is centennial, millennial knowledge of the indigenous population that survives all the massacres that we have been doing to them for the past 500 years, but they're still standing. And the indigenous populations, not only of Brazil, but everywhere in the world, are the only keepers of nature that we need, that the planet needs, that humanity needs. We Western developer capitalists driven for growth are not keeping the forests up, are not keeping the oceans clean. We are trashing, we are destroying. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to value their technology, their innovation, their science that exists for a long time. And then we can bring our leverage to really pump it up and say, no more. When is enough is enough. I think it's urgent to say now, enough is enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. You're talking about big paradigm shift. Let's push for that. And Roberto, you have the last words. Thank you very much.
Obrigado. Eu acho que foi Robert Kennedy que disse que o GDP é como biquíni. Mostra muito, mas esconde o mais importante. Parte do mais importante que esconde é a desigualdade. A outra grande parte que o GDP esconde é o trabalho das mulheres. Com a pandemia, ficou óbvio no mundo que o cuidado foi que salvou o mundo. E esse cuidado foi feito fundamentalmente por mulheres, como um cuidado pago de nurses, enfermeiros, médicas, mas também o trabalho de maestras, o cuidado dos infantes e tal, e fundamentalmente o cuidado não pago de segundo ou terceiro trabalho acrescentado como carga das mulheres. Isso não aparece no GDP em parte alguma e deve realmente o mundo reconhecer para tirar alguma coisa de positivo dessa tragédia que todos temos de sofrer. Obrigado.
Muito obrigada, Roberto. I would like to thank you, everyone here, for participating, for sharing our ideas, and also for, reaffirming our commitment that we will continue pushing. We will continue pushing through developing methodologies such as the index of the cities to allow people to be able to make better decisions, to continue implementing projects like the Spotlight reports and producing data that can help governments to really make good decisions. With that, I'd like to finish our session. Thank you very, very much for staying with us. Thank you, our organizers at Justus, our crew. Thank you, the interpreters. Thank you, all of you who attended, and saying that will be the presentations, including the index, George. I'd like to share through the Civil Society Working Group for Sustainable Development website, so we can promote that and publicize them. And you'll be available and you'll be here and you have our contacts. Please, let's keep in touch and let's keep this fight up. We need to continue pushing for changing for this better world that we think it's possible. And we know it's possible because there is no lack of resources, there is no lack of funds, there is no lack of anything. We have everything that we need. We just don't have the leadership interested in implementing what can be implemented. So it was great to be with all of you. Thank you very much. We'll be connected. Please take care. COVID is still there and be safe. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you the UN, because the UN allow us to have the side events. Thank you also the groups who contributed and financed our Civil Society Spotlight report. Thank you. Take care. Oh, the picture. Can we open the camera so you can have the picture? Sorry. Okay.
Okay. I will take another 1 minute. Thank you, everyone. Good morning.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.